Thank you very much, Seraphim, for this invitation. The starting point of my lecture today is this famous quote by Antonio Gramsci, which is kind of frequently quoted recently from his prison notebooks written between 1929 and 1935, while he was imprisoned by Mussolini's fascist regime. And just incidentally, it is quite astonishing, actually, how Gramsci is nowadays being appropriated by some, if not outright neo-fascists, then at least ideologists of the far right, like Christopher Raffo, for instance, particularly his ideas about cultural hegemony, war of positions, and so on. But that is already a different story, although by no means external to what I will discuss today. Okay, so here is the quote. I'm sure you know it very well. The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. This at least is the popular version of the quote. I will give you the exact one a little bit later. So now is the time of monsters. I guess this quote captures the prevailing sentiment of this kind of doom, bewilderment in response to this series of crises and profound tectonic shifts, not only crises, but also I want to emphasize these profound tectonic shifts taking place in what we perceive as our world. Seraphine already enumerated several of them. So just kind of brutal geopolitical conflicts, wars, economic turmoil, deep structural changes in functioning of capitalism. Some even speak now of techno-feudalism or neo-feudalism. Then political anti-revolutions, one could say, a la Trump. Also some revolutions. We saw something recently in Nepal. So also anti-revolutions a la Trump and accompanying rise of the far right. Each of these unfolding under the long looming shadow also of global warming, which we have all but decided to ignore while focusing instead now almost exclusively on arming ourselves. So the world is changing dramatically before our eyes, and part of this change seems indeed to be the appearance of monsters or strange creatures or strange phenomena, which we would have called or believed illogical or utterly impossible not so long ago. So the quote, as I read it before, is actually more like a paraphrase of Gramsci's original wording, which I quote now. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. So fenomeni morbosi, which morbosi could be also translated as perverse phenomena. And as you probably perhaps know, in ancient Rome, interregnum referred to that moment of legal and political in-betweenness that followed the death of a sovereign and preceded the enthronement of his successor. So the declaration of interregnum was accompanied by the proclamation of justitium, since it was not only sovereignty, but also legality itself that was suspended. And this is a very important thing. I mean, nowadays nobody has officially suspended legality, but in a way, this is actually going on in many places. So as also Andrea Mühlenbach has recently remarked, paraphrasing or summing up this meaning of this quote from Gramsci, she wrote, old hegemonies were crumbling. This is when he wrote it, Gramsci, the ruling order has lost its capacity to lead through consent. The masses had drifted away from traditional ideologies and toward a structure of feeling that awaited full articulation. The horizon was open. Again, I think this resonates in many ways with our times, so-called, except that I guess many of us rather feel that the horizon is rapidly closing, not so much that it is, but still so many things happen, so many surprises pop up that in this sense, it definitely seems to be open to some extent. So a simple question, does Gramsci's this kind of literal phrasing invalidate the rendering of morbid symptoms as monsters? I don't think so, especially if we keep in mind that the term monster carries a very rich etymology which cautions precisely against reducing monsters to mere evil creatures. So, as I'm sure you also know, in classical Latin, monstrum could designate anything extraordinary, like often a sign of or portent, such as, I don't know, malformed animal or child, which showed, mostrare, or signaled that something in the world was out of balance. The etymology also points to monere, to warning signs. So this links monsters, I think, also to what psychoanalysis, here following Marx, calls symptoms, phenomena that signal or point to a deeper disorder, while at the same time also giving body to that disorder. So Gramsci's morbid symptoms clearly move in this direction as well, although this morbid symptom, but with a sharper emphasis on the symptoms of dying, of decay, morbid. But I think it would be too reductive to read the quote only as saying that strange creatures are symptoms of the death of the old, because precisely this emphasis on interregnum, the time between past and future, suggests that monsters can also be understood as a kind of prenatal symptoms or signs arriving from the future, perhaps a warning signs from the future. But I guess this is precisely what raises a further, perhaps a little bit more unsettling question, namely, what if the time of monsters is not merely a transitional phase, but the new world itself? What if there is nothing, let's say, on the other side? How can we be sure that there will be a passage from beyond, or that this interregnum is not itself a new regnum? How do we know that this is not it, that we are not, in fact, already inhabiting this kind of final destination or destination? So we could simply start by asking this question: what precisely is the status and the temporality of our particular time of monsters? And I think what comes to mind first is acceleration, speed. Not only this kind of serial crisis as followed from some things that were said at the beginning, so just one follows upon the other without any kind of interruption. Actually, the next crisis does not really end, but it's kind of suffocated by the previous crisis is suffocated by the new one emerging. So acceleration. And ever since what Francis Fukuyama, for example, called the end of history, ever since this end of history itself came to an abrupt end, it looks like history has become running again very fast, unfolding at a pace faster than we could have imagined. So the time of monsters is a fast time, let's say, marked by tectonic, even revolutionary changes that seem to happen overnight. So the most obvious example, perhaps here, is the United States. Just consider how much and how quickly the country and the world with it has changed since Trump's last inauguration only 8 months ago. Yet this speed may itself be the effect of something else, namely of perhaps our past all too ready acceptance of this ideological narrative according to which the liberal democratic capitalism constitutes the end of history. So in other words, the perceived acceleration may be the result of perhaps our systematically ignoring, repressing, disavowing the shifts, permutations, developments that did take place before, the result of ignoring also the cost of sustaining the idea of the end of history or the end of ideology. The cost of ignoring the reality of social antagonisms, ignoring simply that all the really big questions have been far from resolved or settled. And here I'm simply referring to Fukuyama's own clarification of what his thesis on the end of history meant. He wrote, "This did not mean that the natural cycle of birth, life, and death would end, that important events would no longer happen, or that newspapers reporting them would cease to be published. It meant rather that there would be no further progress in the development of underlying principles and institutions because all of the really big questions had been settled." So I'm sure you know this idea. So the rest of the world, which is not yet there in this liberal democratic capitalism, will simply join in, and that is the end point. Just by the way, if I continue a little bit with this Fukuyamian narrative, I think what is interesting about it and sometimes missed, and by the way, he also recently kind of critically reevaluated his own stance, like kind of criticizing it. But what is interesting also in this original book, The End of History and The Last Man, is that it actually marks or depicts the opposite of what the title would seem to suggest. It doesn't actually say that we have finally reached the end in any sense close to something like the end of the world or some ending in an emphatic sense, but rather it depicts something like that the ending itself has become, that this ending itself is something like impossible to end. In other words, if, let's say, capitalist democracy, as the book proposed, constitutes the end of history, this end can last forever. There is it is not subject to historical time, but has its own temporality in which no intrinsic reasons are there for it to end. So it is an end that can go on endlessly, a kind of Leerlauf, to use a very fitting German term. So in this sense, the end of history signifies that Fukuyama, in the end of history, signifies that we have reached the point and are living in a time that cannot end precisely, or at least not for any intrinsic reasons or intrinsic contradictions. And this kind of ideological framing, which is now completely, I guess, gone, this ideological framing, not completely, but nevertheless, has also played an important role in shaping all these kind of past and still recent fantasies of the end of the world, because this end then, or any serious transformation, any interruption of this Leerlauf, could only be imagined as arriving from the great outside, not from anything that can happen like in history. So this outside was understood as it's not a historical force, but it was understood as a physical universe. And Fred Jameson made this point very nicely. So physical universe, so synonymous more or less with kind of total destruction of the Earth or our world. For example, the Earth will be struck by an asteroid, the sun will explode or burn out, the Earth's core will stop rotating and cause a disaster, and so on. You've seen these movies, I guess, or not, but there were many. And lately, something has shifted also in the structuring of the narrative of the end, titling more towards kind of internal, also social danger and so on. Although I think many still appear to believe in the end of history thesis and behave, I would put it like this, for example, as if Trump were an asteroid that had struck the United States and the world from outer space. And I think this is precisely how the ideology of the end of ideology nevertheless persists in the refusal to acknowledge, let's say, the social disintegration, contradictions produced by the very order epitomized by this ideology of the end of history. For it is this devastation and these contradictions that got Trump elected in the first place from within the so-called end of history and the end of ideology. So to return to the previous question, so the speed with which the developments and tectonic shifts seem to occur today may well result from the fact that the preceding Leerlauf was never really a Leerlauf at all. The impression of stasis was perhaps an effect precisely of denial, disavowal, not simply on the individual, but also on the social scale and level, a failure of, or even a refusal to register the actual transformation and deterioration of social reality, or to heed, refusal to heed the warning signs of that change. So what we perceive today as monsters are precisely what became possible, what came to life because of systematic ignoring and disavowing of those earlier monsters as signs, let's say warning signs. Moreover, I guess what we are experiencing now, perhaps we could put it like this, it's not only our present time, but also the accelerated, fast-forwarded historical unfolding of the almost past 30 years. So no wonder that events appear to happen with such a speed and intensity. Okay, yeah, I used the term disavowal already several times, of which, again, about which, as it was mentioned, I've recently published a small book. I will not reiterate the argument in any extensive way, but I would like to point out some of its possible further implications for understanding and thinking about the time of monsters. But first, just a kind of brief recapitulation for those who may not be familiar with the concept of disavowal, which originates with Freud. Verleugnung is the German term. Freud discusses it primarily in relation to fetishism as fetishistic disavowal, and very, very simply put, like castration or the absence of a penis in the other sex it happens simultaneously acknowledged on a rational level and disavowed by being transferred into a fetish object, like a shoe, a stocking, or so on, fetish object, which actually embodies for me the belief that I rationally no longer hold, but the belief that disavows precisely the fact. Octave Manouni, a French psychoanalyst, later expanded this notion in a broader, more general perspective, and formulating its logic in a very concise formula, which I also take as my starting point. The formula being, I know very well, but all the same, I still believe or behave as if I did not know. So just to go on with this sketchy presentation a little bit longer, there is an important difference, therefore, between repression, Verdrängung, and disavowal, Verleugnung. We can formulate it in simple, perhaps topological terms. Repression implies two dimensions, or like two levels. Our reality and another level in which what has been pushed out, what is repressed, continues to exist and cause some problems, perhaps. So what is repressed no longer forms part of our reality. Disavowal, by contrast, is more like one-dimensional. What is disavowed does not disappear from reality. It remains present on the same level, part of our reality. We fully acknowledge it. Everything is out in the open. We know it well and say so, yet we nevertheless continue to act as if we did not know. Disavowal does not make something vanish. It does not deny something. Rather, it alters the status, its status and meaning. It kind of derealizes it. What is a fact that is not, let's say, the fact itself, but its character as real, as, let's say, extraordinary, surprising, or shattering element within our reality. So when you perceive or learn something and disavow it, it is because obviously that something has the capacity to change your reality. It's not just any stupid thing. The same could be said of repression, of course, Verdrängung. But whereas repression preserves the extraordinary character of something by expelling it from ordinary reality, making it incompatible with it, disavowal keeps it within reality, making it compatible with it while changing its character. So we could say that disavowal consists in transforming what is for me an extraordinary game-changing fact into an ordinary fact, but still a fact. So what is disavowed is not the fact itself or its occurrence, that it took place, but it's precisely shattering, game-changing dimension. And perhaps we could also say that this is what we mean when we speak about a post-factual world today. It's not that facts have disappeared. On the contrary, we are surrounded by nothing but facts, many facts, but that there are just facts in the sense that they no longer bear the weight of any real. We could put it like this. Okay, and to conclude this quick summing up presentation, I also detect a shift in the contemporary functioning of disavowal, namely a move from its classical formula, I know very well, but nevertheless, to something more like, I know very well, and I declare this knowledge, making sure that others know that I know. And this is precisely why I can go on as if it were nothing, why I can go on ignoring it. So in other words, as you can see, the very declaration of knowledge now functions as a fetish object, shielding me from the reality of the same knowledge. So to ignore something effectively, I must first openly acknowledge it, say, I know all about it, and then this works. So in this double move, knowledge and our usual, let's say, usually public claim that we know very well becomes itself fetish, the very thing that prevents us from kind of truly trusting, registering what we know and acting upon it. So not only do we know something and still act as if we did not, the very declaration of this knowledge becomes the screen that allows us to go on living and enjoying precisely as before. And this last emphasis is quite crucial because the key, I think, to understanding this perverse disavowal is to recognize that it is not merely a coping mechanism. It could be this, but I think there is a distinction. It's not merely a coping mechanism, but also, and perhaps above all, a means of enjoyment. So the destination of disavowal becomes this destination of disavowal towards enjoyment becomes especially clear in the case, obviously, of sexual fetishism. The fetish enables us not only to ignore a certain reality, say, of castration, whatever, but also to actively enjoy the very instrument of that ignoring, the object fetish. So this is the emphasis. It's not so much, okay, reality is terrible, we cope with it, which is much more normal, and understandable. But here it's a slightly different structure that takes place. Okay, a further important point is that disavowal is not simply subjective, or not necessarily simply subjective individual category, but also has its social existence. Beliefs circulate socially. There are institutions that sustain and support them, and so on. Also in terms of this kind of fetish objects. And I think one could argue that it has become disavowal kind of predominant, perhaps, feature of our social and political life, and in this sense goes well beyond personal psychology, a kind of neurosis of our time, although it's not exactly neurosis. So, and in the book, I also explore the difference between denial, which is at work, for example, in conspiracy theories, and disavowal. Their structure is quite different, since disavowal never directly denies reality and therefore appears much more rational, much more normal, in contrast to these crazy deniers and advocates, perhaps, of conspiracy theories that we point our finger at. Yet, if we look more closely at the outcome, the difference between the two all but evaporates. So, outright denying climate change or acknowledging it only to go on exactly as before or more or less amount to much the same thing. Or consider the financial crash of 2008, while no one could deny its reality. The response was largely to declare never again, while rebuilding the very same structures that had produced the crisis in the first place. And many, many other examples of this kind could be quoted. So the difference in style between denial and disavowal, however, which is both striking and significant, is precisely what provides, I think, a very powerful ideological framework for late capitalism. Because it sustains the belief that, politically speaking, we are dealing with a real substantial alternative here, a genuine choice leading to different social results, which is not necessarily the case at all. So, as I said, disavowal is far less extravagant and looks more reasonable than denial, this kind of outright refusal to acknowledge or accept certain facts, which fuels conspiracy theories and some other things. Disavowal claims to be very well aware of the problem and is seamlessly fused very often with what we like to call, I don't know, the liberal mainstream, let's call it like this, including the economic and political centers of power. And in this sense, in this framing, in this staging, where we have this bizarre alternative, disavowal, denial, I think, politically speaking, we seem to be caught in a very macabre dance between the two. Denial, often associated also with far-right populism or any extreme movement, denial on the one hand, and perverse disavowal associated with the business-as-usual mainstream on the other hand, now appear as two principal competing political options. Each feeds on the pathologies of the other, responding primarily to one another rather than to any social reality, by which I mean the material conditions of people's lives, economic, environmental, and so on, as well as any acknowledgement of the obviously still ongoing class struggle. So with all this in mind, and to push the argument further, let us now return to our time of monsters. Okay, Trump again. Is he a monster, or rather our fetish? In the strict Freudian sense, where the fetish is the last thing we see before perceiving the scandalous absence or whatever the scandalous thing. Actually, Slavoj Žižek has suggested as much, namely that in the past decades leading up to the last election, Trump functioned for Democrats precisely as a Freudian fetish functions in disavowal. He was the last thing they saw before seeing, let's say, the class struggle, the social problems of American society. And so they clung to this fetish, focusing almost exclusively on Trump and little else in the campaign. And we might call this a reversed MAGA fantasy, the belief that simply removing Trump would make America great again. In this way, one disavows all the processes and conditions that had to be in place for something like Trump to be elected and elected for a second time. Again, except if we believe that he is on an asteroid that just hit us from the outer space. But I'm not saying, or at the same time, I'm not saying at all that without Trump, everything would be just the same as it is now, since the problems that led to his election were systemic. What I'm saying is that the two levels are involved in this development, and we should keep both in mind. So Trump's particular persona was able to give a concrete form to pre-existing antagonisms and to steer them in a certain direction. Even though the problem is systemic, its concrete form and appearance are always determined also by some contingency, in this case also by Trump, although this kind of politics is also not completely contingent. But it could have gotten a slightly different form, of course. So I will stay with the example of Trump because precisely today Trump is no longer simply a person named Donald Trump. He has become almost what Deleuze would call a conceptual persona or conceptual character, or in another register, since this is perhaps not really conceptual, but a brand name for a certain kind of politics, a certain way also of doing politics. And this brand now extends far beyond the individual and is spreading rapidly in many countries, including European ones. So and I think one conceptually interesting feature of this brand is that it also kind of effectively blurs the distinction a little bit between denial and disavowal, or perhaps we should say that it invents a third logic, a new brand of disavowal, something that I'm tempted to call a fetishization of inconsistency. On the one hand, Trump shares with standard conspiracy theorists a blunt denial of many scientific and social facts. On the other hand, it is hard to escape the impression that he is not even sincere in this, that he has, that he does not always even believe in his own denial, so to speak, and that these proclaimed beliefs are pretty much random or opportunistic, dependent on the occasion. And one might object that there is nothing new in this, that it merely repeats the familiar logic of cynical figures of power. But I would argue that something is different and more complicated at work here. This is not only about cynicism or kind of open embrace of opportunism. what we see here is an active production, I would say even active production and maintenance, revelation of inconsistency. Today is this, tomorrow the opposite, but this inconsistency is not a weakness to be exposed by the opponents of such politics. It is a central ingredient of its success. I remember there was a point at which Trump even kind of really, truly, perversely was saying something like, you never know with me. You never know where you stand. This is kind of, but anyway. And I think this has been demonstrated hundreds of times, pointing out contradictions, exposing falsehoods, tracking radical shifts in position. His position proves to be utterly ineffective line of attack. If anything, such critics only kind of reinforce its trend. So the shifting between contradictory statements, together with ignorance, vulgar behavior, and countless accidents that blatant mispronunciation and confusion even of state names, I don't know, calling Armenia, Albania, and so on. I mean, there are many examples. All this becomes itself a kind of source and trademark of power which can afford this without any consequences, because it is power. And it could also be seen as a source of identificatory enjoyment for his supporters to some extent. We all make mistakes. We are not this kind of hyper-educated elite, and so on and so on. So I said before that Trump is not just an individual, but a kind of brand name for a certain mostly right-wing Western politics. But by this, I don't simply mean that other politicians and leaders imitate his style, his inconsistency, his extravagance. There is some of this, but mostly it's not like this that this story or this complicity takes place. Something a bit more complex is taking place. And for example, NATO chief Mark Rutte, recently referring to Trump as daddy who sometimes has to use strong language, this remark is a very important relevant of this structure, which is not simply a structure of imitation, but there is another libidinal game at place here. And I will try to kind of analyze it a little bit. So not only he has imitators and doubles, like perhaps Milei in Argentina, Trump is also providing a kind of a roof, a backing, and a push for another brand of reactionary political agenda, which, for being less extravagant and blatantly ridiculous, is in effect no different or less catastrophic. And I think in many European countries, right-wing politicians who may appear less extravagant are quick also to profit from the Trumpian wind, promoting their own in their own countries these much more extreme, hate-filled, unrestrained political agendas that only a short time ago and without this strong Trumpian wind would be still impossible or unacceptable. They would be much more timid than they are now in this configuration. Moreover, and I believe that this is to be a crucial element of this kind of geopolitical dynamics we are witnessing, Trump personally kind of takes upon himself the contradiction deeply embedded in this brand of politics. He actually ventures to embody this contradiction for everybody to see. He embodies it, carries it proudly, therefore allowing the rest of us precisely to disavow it, as I will try to argue. So at work here is a very strong and often sickening complicity between Trump and what once passed as a moderate, let's say, center-right. A good place to analyze this complicity and how it works is, I think, the speech he delivered at the Charlie Kirk commemoration rally recently. I think it is almost a textbook laboratory case of Trump stepping in and offering to embody the most striking contradiction that emerged within this particular situation, the killing of Charlie Kirk, in order to consolidate his followers, his supporters around the given political agenda, which is quite independent of this accident, of this incident. To unleash a war on anything and anyone who fails to share this particular political agenda and dares to oppose it. So everybody is now risking the label terrorism. So this fundamental contradiction in the case of this Charlie Kirk rally, but not only in that case, has to do with Christianity, actually, with Christian values, which Kirk was declared to embody, and his racist, misogynist, homophobic, anti-immigrant, pro-guns views that he advocated so loudly and it seems so effectively. And by the way, this contradiction already reached, this very similar contradiction already reached its full proportion in the context of the so-called refugee crisis in the 2016, when self-proclaimed Christian politicians went through all kinds of acrobatics to make their own violent, racist, anti-immigrant politics compatible with Christian values, particularly the commandment to love your neighbor as thyself. And I've written about this in some other, I won't repeat this here, but so this is something similar is being replayed here. So here we are at the Kirk's mass commemoration rally, organized and promoted as a celebration of his life as illustrious, even saintly, his life as saintly, and as enthronement, consolidation of everything he represented as a kind of model Christian life, which obviously, since he was shot, is portrayed as being in danger and under threat by extremely evil and powerful forces, the radical left, whatever this means, and we know it can cover just about anything kind of not compatible with MAGA politics. So I don't know if you've seen this commemoration or heard about it or whatever, but first in her speech, Kirk's widow, Erica, emphasized forgiveness. Like Jesus Christ, she said, Charlie would forgive the young man who shot him. So her speech was kind of sentimental, full of charitable sentiments. Then Trump spoke. Here is a particularly interesting part of his speech, which I will now read out to you. I'm sure you heard about it. He said the following: he, Charlie, did not hate his opponents. He wanted the best for them. Here I disagree with Charlie. I hate my opponent. And he really kind of strongly, passionately emphasized the word hate. I cannot even reproduce the passion. I hate my opponent. And I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry, Erica, he went on, but I can't stand my opponent. And the crowds were cheering at that point. Then he continued pointing at the sky. Charlie is angry. Look at that, he's angry at me now. He wasn't interested in demonizing people. He was interested in persuading everyone to the ideas and principles he believed were good, right, and true. Before each appearance, he prayed those words, God, use me for your will. Always said the same thing, use me for your will. And this is exactly what God did. This is end of quote, after which the speech went on and Trump continued by painting all the horrible violence and the methods of the left, threatening the threatening danger it presents, and which he is here precisely to stop. Okay, before going into analysis of this configuration, what is happening here, let me just make also one brief remark about what I see as properly perverse, indeed sadist, penchant on the emphasis on Kirk's being the willing instrument of God's will. Jacques Lacan pinned this down really, really, very, very well when he demonstrated how the pervert always presents himself as the instrument of the other's will and enjoyment. Pervert, it's not the one just enjoying unrestrainedly without scruples and so on. No, he has a job to do. He works for the enjoyment of the other, as Sartre does. I mean, this is all very hard work. He is the instrument of the enjoyment of the other. Okay, but this is not the line that I will pursue here today. So the quoted part of Trump's speech did, of course, get some attention among the opponents. The emphasis on hate was duly underlined. The fact that he spoke out this kind of unspoken truth of the Disraeli. But I think this is not all. We have to think about this speech a little bit further. For I really think it's a masterpiece of the performance of Trumpism, and it provides the key also to this kind of complicity and populist success. So, as you know, Trump has always been admired by his supporters for speaking his mind, as they say, saying it as it is, for not pretending that he is or feels any different from what he says, even when this goes against whatever the rules of politeness and common decency. So he's perceived as saying out loud what everybody thinks, or many people. And this is often taken as a form of courage in the midst of political diplomatic hypocrisy. But I think if we stop at this analysis, he's saying out loud what everybody thinks, we miss a crucial dimension of his rhetoric, which is much more specific. And after all, the same description could also apply to another very positive political figures to say something, articulate something which everybody feels. What Trump says out loud and what others do not dare to say, perhaps, even if they feel it, is always something nasty, charged with violent, illicit emotions, such precisely as his emphatic declaration, "I hate my opponents." So he gives voice to violence and illicit enjoyment that form the hidden, let's say, underside of the good, right, and true ideas presented here in this configuration as Christian. He does not deny this underside or pretend that it isn't there, or ask us to ignore and play the standard hypocrisy game. Instead, he proposes something else: to stage the contradiction, to blow it up to its full proportions, and to offer himself as the one who will take care of the dark side, but also make us embody this contradiction. So this is the configuration that was staged there and deployed at the Charlie Kirk's rally. Kirk was cast as a man of Christian ideas and principle, a missionary, as Trump also called him. But as history shows, this spreading and establishment of Christian rule has also required crusades and crusaders to do, let's say, the dirty work. So the message, or more accurately, the deal offered by Trump to the American people, and we know how much he likes a good deal, was this: we are all Christians, but Christianity is under attack, so we have a problem. You go on being Christians, keep feeling good about your Christianity and your Christian values, and I will do the dirty work for you. You do the Christian thing, while I will hate for you, I will persecute immigrants and others for you, even kill them if necessary. And note that Trump did not speak of enemies in this quote, but of opponents. I hate my opponent. This is, I think, a rhetorically extremely skillful displacement of the emotional charge from I hate the person who committed this murder, killed Charlie Kirk, something that many can indeed humanly relate to, even in this context. Why should we want the best for them? But this is precisely displaced to a much broader terrain encapsulated by the final formula: I hate my opponent, I can't stand my opponent, and everybody cheering there. So what this perspective, I think, allows us to see is that it is not enough to complain in disbelief about how Trump manages to get away with inconsistencies, contradictions, and that so often leave people stunned. He does not prevail and stay in power in spite of these inconsistencies, but because of them, or more specifically, because of how he wraps them into a political deal that he is offering. And I think precisely here we encounter once more the paradoxical structure of disavowal, this time put to direct political use. The contradiction is out in the open, no longer secret or obfuscated. We know all about it, and therefore we can ignore it. So spelling it out relieves it of much of its charge. So Trump is not simply an eccentric exception who unites and totalizes the rest of the social body. Rather, he is, in yet another sense, the fetish that enables his supporters to disavow the ugly side of this new kingdom, while at the same time fully acknowledging it, even cheering it. So this is why it is, I think, also a bit short-sighted to claim, as some on the left do, that Trump is perhaps preferable to certain Democrats because at least with him we know where we stand, since everything is spelled out so openly. But I think such view ignores the power game of disavowal precisely. If knowing it all only helps us ignore what we know and carry on as before, then the joke is on us. We are not any better off because of it. So it is also in this sense that I spoke earlier of fetishization of inconsistency. The inconsistency and contradiction are not hidden, suppressed, or obfuscated. On the contrary, they are blatantly and shamelessly paraded by this leader figure as his trademark. He states it quite directly: I'm Christian and I hate everyone who crosses my way. If we simply rush to expose this as a contradiction or inconsistency, I guess we miss the point completely. He's meant to embody, perform these two things at the same time, to display not only the other side of this kind of Christian rule, but also make us comfortable with it, to bring this hidden side to the surface, weaving it into the surface, and thereby precisely transforming the configuration from repression, from Verdrängung to disavowal, Verleugnung. And I think, and I need like 5 more minutes. I hope I can go on as long as that, just to wrap this out, because I think now we have to see what is the effect of this maneuver on many, let's say, Western leaders, and particularly European leaders as well, is quite stunning. So apart from those who directly embrace his position, and the few who remain fully critical also in their actions, to the great majority have a much more intimate and complex relationship with Trumpism. They buy into the deal he proposes, even if they roll their eyes whenever he speaks. And I think this is my opinion here, one of the clearest and very disturbing manifestation of this logic came when the German Chancellor Merz explained that by killing tens of thousands of Palestinians or starving, displacing others, Netanyahu, another, I think, really prominent Trumpian figure, was just doing the dirty job for all of us. So, do we want this? I mean, in this framing, we Europeans can go on living our lives and clinging to our precious, delicate European values, while the bullies do the dirty work for us, and a really dirty work at that. So I think this situation is really kind of, when things are even openly said in that way, we are really in a kind of extremely difficult position, and the question of how to break out of it is extremely difficult. So obviously many things would need to change in the global geopolitical configuration to dismantle this sinister complicity. And breaking the spell of disavowal of this kind is not something that one can simply decide to do. But the fact remains that most of us, often for reasons of sanity, tend to disavow the amplitude and scale of the tectonic shifts and horrors that we are seeing or living through simply in order to go on living. So I'm not raising here a moralist finger against people who just want to be left in peace and continue with their lives. I think it's rather that there are many warning signs telling us that if we truly want to survive, live in peace, go on with our lives, a profound change, of course, is necessary. So the accumulated costs of our disavowal, both social and environmental, are about to crash down on us. Those who are not particularly thrilled by fantasies of how the rise of the far right will make the world great again are numbed instead by the spectacle of everything almost seeming to go to hell. Certainly there is much fear around, and for good reasons. We sense that we are living in a kind of imminent proximity to catastrophe, except that for many catastrophe is already their reality, and we can also see this. So the belief that present politics can protect us from this destiny, if only we are willing to accept the price of that such protection, dirty work and so on, is profoundly mistaken. Not only for the obvious reasons, but also because a kind of paranoid power, which this particular power certainly is. Again, I wrote a whole paper on this, but this is not what I'm doing here now. Paranoid power tends to turn very quickly against its own people and its own allies, as we can already see in the case of the United States. In the end, what such power claims so desperately to protect us against may well prove rather benign compared with the catastrophe of their protection itself, their actions in them. So perhaps this shift is the shift of perspective that would be required, a shift from the catastrophe they paint for us in such dramatic colors to the catastrophe of their protecting us, the catastrophe they themselves embody. This catastrophe is quite real, and we are already deeply plunged into it. Do we really need more, or how much more exactly? So, and I will conclude in literally 1 minute. I think one thing is certain: the moment of drawing the line can never be calculated as we go along. It never simply follows from the immediacy of events. It always requires, there is always a moment of decision, a precipitated decision before we have everything available to decide. A leap to a different ground. That was enough. Usually it's even in past tense. And it is only from the perspective of that decision that we can retroactively recognize that this indeed was the right moment, perhaps even the last moment. So, and this decision is nothing more nor less than precisely saying enough before catastrophe becomes our only word and its monsters something here to stay. But this enough, as decisive and crucial as it is, may in fact be the easier part. For the real work, the work of organizing, reorganizing ourselves in a different political, social, environmental logic only begins then. So, and this, of course, is what also Zizek refers to as the problem of the day after. So perhaps the true question is, are we ready for that?